Just a helpful hint for any listeners that may have kiddos around, these are conversations between adults intended for adults. There is the potential for some adult subject matter or adult language. Hello, hello. This is Danielle Ireland, and you are listening to Don't Cut Your Own Bangs, an interview. The first official interview I have done since having my sweet, sweet baby girl. And I am incredibly proud and honored that this interview happens to be with the powerhouse woman that you all are about to meet, Betsy Murphy. This woman, she leads spiritual retreats in Zimbabwe. She has written a best-selling memoir, is a screenwriter, she's a performer, she's a speaker, she's a writing coach, and a healer. There are so many facets to her professional and creative life. But what we talk about in this interview is not just what she does, but what drives her to do what she does. And I think the why behind her journey it's what makes it so compelling. I am continually humbled by the fact that though our life experiences can be so varied, and Betsy's life experiences are a just incredible, interesting adventure that you will get to hear about. But what we are searching for, what we hope to find, and what we want our lives to feel like, to become, at the end of the day, they feel so similar. We're hungry for pleasure and joy, and we talk about all of those things. And I want to share, before I introduce you to Betsy in the interview, I want to share 3 of my favorite takeaways from this, and you'll hear these mentioned throughout the interview. The first is how gratitude kept me alive. Her experience with a shaman named Gogo. I mean, if that's not even like its own book title, I don't know what is. How gratitude kept me alive. How feeling it all is what's necessary. And following the footprints of the women before her that led her to where she is today. And I just thought that was such a beautiful image, following the footprints of the women that came before her. I also want to leave you with, at the very end of the interview, I asked her what the best advice was she ever received. And it came to her in a dream. And that advice, it's simple, it's easy to remember, but it doesn't make it any less impactful. So I hope that you are ready to really sit back, relax, and enjoy the Betsy Murphy experience. Welcome to the Don't Cut Your Own Bangs podcast. It is such a pleasure, such an honor and pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here, and I really appreciate your work in the world, and I look forward to chatting about how our work is connected.
Yes, me too. And I just want to share with our listeners some of the beautiful facets of the work that you do. So Betsy Murphy is an author of the memoir Autobiography of an Orgasm, and we will be discussing some of that. She is a speaker, she's a screenwriter, she's a writing coach, she's a performer. I got to see an incredible one-woman show that she did for Indie Fringe Festival just last month. She's a multifaceted artist and storyteller and healer. She brings healing and encourages healing through writing. And I'm so excited to get to dive into just a bit of what you do and learn from you and introduce you to the Don't Cut Your Own Bang listeners.
Sounds good. Good to be here.
I bumped into Betsy at a dinner for the Patashoo Foundation a couple of months ago. And it was one of those meetings, and I'm sure everyone who's on social media has an experience like this, where I hadn't actually met Betsy in person, but I knew her face instantly when I saw her at this dinner. And it was one of those moments where I wanted to just wave and say hi, like we had a relationship, but all of our interactions had been through social media, which is, I think, a beautiful aspect of social media. It does actually connect. And you were so gracious when I came up and said hello. And funny story that I actually, a year prior, had signed up, maybe 2 years prior, had signed up for a program that Betsy was leading called the Writers, like it was a writing workshop, and you would create prompts at the beginning of the year to encourage people to write every day. And I signed up for that. And I had completely forgotten about that until I introduced myself to you at that dinner. So I love how sometimes the universe, you brush up against someone and you come apart, and you brush up against and come apart. And now here we are today having a conversation. But I wanted to thank you for your generosity and your graciousness. It was so great to finally meet you in person. And I'm just curious what that experience was like for you, because I felt like we had kind of a similar moment at that dinner.
Well, it was wonderful. First of all, I kind of snuck into Indianapolis a few weeks early, and I'm born and raised there. I live in Northern California now, but I was going to be, there for the Indie Fringe doing my show. But I didn't tell most of my friends that I was coming in that early because I needed to focus on rehearsals and not be out socializing. But I love Patachou Foundation and was fortunate to get the tickets to this first Friday. And it was so fun running into you there. And this is, I know we all complain about social networking, but this is one of the positives about social networking, these connections that we make. And at just the right time, you bump into each other again. I just this week, every Wednesday on my Instagram feed, I do something called Write On Wednesday, where I offer a writing prompt for my book, Write On, which was inspired by those prompts that we started all doing together 2 years ago. And just to get people into a daily writing practice of 15 minutes. And I know you do this so well with others. And just this week, somebody I don't know emailed me from Norway and said, I'd like to join you next week to read my story. So this is how we can connect now. In the 1950s, when all the artists, poets, painters, musicians hanging out in the Village in New York City and connecting that way and inspiring each other, now we can do it through social networking. So if you use it right, there are many gifts to it. So it was definitely a gift to see you then at that night and then be here today with you.
Yes, I like that. If you use it right. I've actually given that a lot of thought lately because I believe that it can be a tool. That used like a tool, it can be used for construction. It can also be used for destruction. And I think the most constructive way I have found is just to trust, lean in, engage, just really engage and connect with either feeds or people that seem to feed something for me or offer something to me. And your feed definitely does that. And your work definitely does that. I want to talk about your work. I've seen your Walk the Talk that you did. Walk the Talk is a TED-inspired speaker series that's intended to inspire, create connection and community, and share stories in Indianapolis. It was hosted at the Vogue, which is this great theater in Indianapolis. And I believe, Betsy, am I correct that you were in your talk was in like the first Walk the Talk series that was done?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And I believe I was the group that have followed you. And I remember hearing about your story and I remember watching your talk and just loved your presence and just how genuine you were and gracious with what you revealed about yourself. And so having experienced that story, obviously knowing some about your book, Autobiography of an Orgasm, and then the content I've seen you create since, there seems to be this intersection between art, healing, pleasure, expression, and creation. And I was just hoping if you could tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, especially for women, we live in a world that women are silenced in many ways. And this is another reason why I like social networking, because it does allow women to give themselves a platform. They don't have to have permission from corporations run by men. And with the talk I did, the theme was positive thinking. So everybody had very motivational, positive thinking, kind of self-help. And mine was about how positive thinking, how our body aligns with positive thinking through feeling good, through expression, through our natural expression of orgasm. I'm not talking about the orgasm that we see in movies or perhaps porn, if you're exposed to that. I'm talking about your body's natural ability to feel good, to express itself through however that feels through your orgasm. And for many years, I didn't express myself. I didn't think it was possible. I had some damage due to assaults. And I didn't think it was possible, but I didn't say anything to anybody because it was embarrassing. I was shameful. I never spoke about that. We don't talk about these things. So when I was writing my first book, it was actually it was a story about my life between the US and going to work in Zimbabwe. This girl from Indiana going to Zimbabwe. I thought that was the story. And then through my writing circles, I kept hearing, no, there's one line in that story about your sensual path. And, and I was like, there's no way I could tell the truth about that. And it was in that moment that I got this zing in my body. And I thought, that's where the story is. And I'm going to write it first for myself. I was not writing it for anybody else. I was not writing it to become a book. I didn't have a title. I didn't have a book cover. And once I wrote it for myself, I became bold enough or courageous enough to release it out to the world, because I started hearing people say, and this is 2014, so this is pre-Me Too, which really a lot of people were coming out in 2017. The other thing about the story was I wasn't going into this happened to me and all these people that suppress my voice. It was, I'm really curious why my body doesn't feel safe expressing itself. And is there anything I can do to feel safe again in my body? And once I felt safe again, I noticed the connection to my voice, because my body was healed. But every time I tell my story, I'd start to sweat. I'd start crying, even though I was healed of everything. And I realized, wow, for so many of us, we are not used to telling the truth about our lives or speaking it from a vulnerable place. So that for me was the next challenge. I'm not a trained performer. I'm not a public speaker. I was a former TV journalist, but I read off a teleprompter. So for me to get up on stage and talk for 5 minutes or 15 minutes, where the show you saw was an hour, is terrifying. And it is absolutely not just part of my healing path, but part of my passion, part of what makes me feel alive and brings vitality into my life now. And we have to do more of those things.
Well, there's an expression, and I wish I could think of who to credit it to, but it's not mine. It's definitely a reference from something I heard, but it seems from the art and the creativity that I've seen of yours, and even what you just shared here, that your healing became your medicine. So it was a part of your personal healing journey, but it's also the gift that you offer others. And I think that's the generosity that vulnerability can have. There's a few things that came out of what you said that I really would like to highlight, because I think it's so important. You didn't say it exactly this way, but when you were describing not the orgasm you see in movies and in porn versus the actual expression of positivity, like in your body, what that made me think of was performative. Like we could look at it like performative sex versus an actual sensual experience. But I also think, all things are one thing. So whether we're talking about sex or how we show up in the area of our lives, for me, the performative aspect in my emotional healing journey that's coming up most often today is eliminating the I'm fine, the sort of robotic auto responses to greetings that we have with one another. How can I show up in a way that there's integrity? And also, I'm not necessarily inviting intimacy in every conversation. Like, I'm not always wanting to go into the deep places. And so I'm still exploring that space for myself of where is the sincerity and the authenticity? Where does that intersect with also honoring the time and the bandwidth I have to really engage? But specifically thinking about performing positive thinking, that makes me think of toxic positivity. For a long, long time, I thought if I said the right thing, if I had the right mantra, if I had the right self-care practice, if I performed being a holistically well person, that I would feel that way. Even as I say this, I get a little tripped up and confused, because I do think that some healing can come from the outside in. That I know the science behind it. If I smile long enough, my body will start to have physiological responses of more happiness. I understand that. For me, I have always operated more from the inside out, though. It's like I have to go within. Well, I shouldn't say have to, but I go within and I explore. Curiosity is one of my absolute favorite words. I love that you use that. I go in and I get curious, and then I can make sense of the external world after I go in first. And maybe that's the writer part. But and we can talk about specifically your orgasm if you're open to that, or any other element of your life where this resonates. But how do you find clarity around those moments in your life that are performative, that are kind of placating or peacekeeping, versus making peace within yourself and getting clear and more real?
It's interesting, when the book was released in 2014, it was filled with secrets that I'd never shared with anyone, including my closest friends and my family. My father wasn't alive at the time, but my mother was, and she was not happy about it. We don't talk about those things. One of my closest friends said, "I'm sorry you were hurting so much and I didn't know about it." So it was one of those moments of, am I going to tell the truth about my life and be willing to show up for these more challenging conversations where I may have some consequences too? I did not write about the few men that I wrote about in the book in the context of where I was. I wasn't making any of them look bad. It was where I was. One gave me permission to share our story, and another one threatened to sue me. So I'm finally telling the truth about my life, and people didn't want to hear it. And I had to be willing to, as a former people pleaser, I had to be willing to, accept the consequences of that and stay really in my lane and on my path with it all, and not trying to make peace with everyone else. My mother and I actually didn't talk for several months. And at one point I thought I might never talk to her again. She just was not willing to show up for these conversations. And here you're sharing this truth about yourself, and she didn't want to listen. She finally did read the book 2 years later because her book club chose it. And she was, but how can we in today's world, and you as a therapist, you have this with your clients, they'll show up and tell you what's going on, but they're unwilling to have the challenging conversations with those people in their lives. So we have to stop being performative and start being real.
Yeah, the people pleasing. Oh, Betsy, the people pleasing. And you also mentioned a moment before about the sweat when you would speak your truth. I don't know if I'll ever outgrow that. When my body and soul are confronted with like a deep, vulnerable truth, I will pit out anything I'm wearing. Oh, my word. And I also am glad that you talked about the consequences of people pleasing, because I think just like we talked about some of the beautiful potential components of connecting on social media, I do think that one of the challenges can sometimes be is there just isn't the space. We don't engage with those platforms in a way that really allows depth, like we're able to have right now in a podcast, which is why I love podcasting. And so the saying, accepting the consequences of people pleasing in one way, also, I think it's helpful to, I guess I'm self-censoring a little bit, because I know that sometimes even the way I show up on social media, maybe to kind of throw a blurb out, and then it doesn't always allow for the fact to acknowledge that there will be consequences, not necessarily always negative consequences, but there's a reason why we call it growing pains. There's some stretching and there's some discomfort. There's a burn, a good burn, but there is a burn. When you focus more on your own pleasure, your own needs and wants at the expense of someone else's comfort or potential discomfort. And that's hard, especially I have a very close relationship with my mother. Both my parents are still alive. Hearing you talk about your parents, it just is humbling to me to recognize that I don't know if we ever really outgrow wanting our parents to approve of the choices we make, and how hard that is, no matter where you are in life. I was trying to just very briefly put myself in your shoes, and okay, if I revealed something that was true to me that could threaten the relationship I have with my parents, that would be a real firewalk. That would be going through a real ring of fire. And the fact that you did that is incredible. And I'm glad that the two of you did find your way back together. At least it sounds like you did. But the other thing that I was thinking of as well was Elizabeth Gilbert wrote a book called Big Magic, The Art of Creative Living Beyond Fear. And she talks about the risk you take in pursuing a creative life is, she calls it eating a shit sandwich. Which shit sandwich are you willing to eat? And what she meant was when you're pursuing something that you want to make, that you love to make, that you want to see out in the world, you basically are deciding, like, there's no guarantee in the outcome being what you want, but it's the process. And in that process, you're going to take some shit. And of course, she said it in a very kitschy, clever way. But in terms of your people pleasing, like your art, your storytelling, and the work you're putting out in the world, and then your own healing too, that beauty, the shit sometimes you have to take is it's going to ruffle feathers. And it sounds like it ruffled not only feathers of people you love, but maybe former lovers that didn't love your version of the truth.
You know, what's interesting is once I did release the book, and literally I got naked, and it was odd because it was so vulnerable, and then it was so liberating. And at the same time, all of a sudden life got a lot easier because I had been living in a fake created this fake world around me. And I'm sure the universe was so confused. And once I just like said, this is me, this is what I've gone through. I'm good. And even my mom and I are closer than ever now, but this is me. And it was like, maybe other people didn't recognize me because they were used to what I was projecting, but the universe recognized me and I recognized me. And all of a sudden, life was so much easier and I was getting more and more opportunities that I, hadn't come easy before. So sometimes we're living this life that looks good but doesn't feel good. And once we talk about, following our gut or trusting our heart. Once you do that, are you willing to show up in those vulnerable moments where not everybody is cheering you on? But for the first time, I was cheering myself on and not trying to be somebody else. I appreciate, I'm a few decades older than you, and I don't think I could have done this in my 30s or 40s. I'm close to 60 now. And it's like, what do I have to lose? But I hope we're living in a world where people don't have to lose anything ever, by speaking up and telling the truth. I'm the mother of 3 grown sons and 1 grown daughter and 2 young granddaughters. And I'm definitely fighting for the world that I want them to continue living in, where they can show up, be themselves, not ever have to feel shame around their body or feel like they can't tell the truth. But right now, and this is where you go back to the negative side of social networking, where as a woman, I am constantly attacked for my looks, my body, for what's coming out of my mouth. So that's the negative side. But this is where you work on yourself so that when those things do show up, you block, you move on, but you don't spend time on it because there are still very unhealthy people in the world. And you can't let that stop you from finding that place where your passion meets what the world needs right now.
I'm going to sit with that for a little while after this interview. I really liked that. As you were also talking to, again, this theme of the performative aspect, living to please and keep peace at the expense of the peace within yourself. As it relates to the sessions I've had with clients and even in my own healing journey, I didn't actually start therapy until I decided to become a therapist. What I didn't know then that I know now is that I really, and I might get a little sweaty acknowledging it this way, but I thought I could outsmart my own emotional healing. That if I learned the tools and if I became a quote unquote expert, that I would be able to fix myself. Again, that's language I don't like using because that's not actually what I believe now, but I can look back at myself when I was in grad school on this journey. And I know that that was true for me then. That was definitely true for Danielle a few years ago. And it wasn't until I started sitting in sessions and people would begin feeling safe with me and revealing their truths to me that my body would start to experience those zings, as you called them. My body was it was kinetically responding to truth. People were revealing a truth that I recognized as true within myself. In therapy, we call that countertransference. But that's when I realized, I need to talk to someone too. And it wasn't until I started doing my own therapy that everything else I had done prior to that in terms of a therapeutic experience. I don't believe that all therapeutic experiences have to happen in a therapy office with a therapist. A lot of those things happen to come together for me when I started to participate in the same way that I was telling everyone it was okay to do, but wasn't allowing to be okay for myself. And what I recognized was that I was carrying around this loneliness because I wasn't letting myself be fully seen. And that's so much of what I heard from you is that particularly if we can talk about like clinical depression or even the emotional experience of being depressed or feeling low, feeling blue, I certainly don't want anyone to feel like they have to adopt depression to describe their experience if that's not what feels true. But it's often described as this deep loneliness. And I think when you live your life performing in one aspect or another, the real you is never seen. And it's it's like the lesson that I keep being reminded of over and over again is that what we want more than anything is to be seen fully as ourselves. That's like the gold medal at the end of doing all of this work that we've been talking about so far is that you may lose people, but what you gain is yourself and fully seeing yourself. And that's hard, but I can't trade that now. It's like once you get a taste of it, I tell clients sometimes it's like once you smell bullshit, you can't unsmell it. So whether it's in someone else or yourself, like it's just, you can't unknow the truth once you know it.
It reminds me of the opening line of Autobiography of an Orgasm. I had my first orgasm when I was 36, which means I spent half my life faking it. And it's a funny, and people laugh, it's a funny line, but then I go on to say, I faked it through 2 marriages, numerous lovers. I faked it because I didn't think it was possible for me to feel anything after years of unexpressed pain, abuse, assault, not feeling safe in my body. And it's interesting with that book, especially men that would come up to me that knew me from my past. And when it came out, they'd go, oh, I don't need to read that. They didn't know what it was about. Wink, wink. I'm good. I don't need to read that. And they had no idea what it was about. And at first I would laugh along with them too, because I didn't want them to feel uncomfortable. And then I found this way to connect, because many women read their book and then pass it on to their partners. And sometimes it's women that have been married for 30 years and pass it on to the partners. And for the first time, they had really open, transparent conversations about our bodies, orgasms, sex, what you like, what you didn't like. So they were able to experience, you talk about the counter linking up within a session, whether it's, during a TED Talk or with a client, but that same thing, to be that connected with somebody on an intimate level, when so many of us, including me, were so afraid of intimacy because that would reveal my truth. When the book came out, the other thing people go like, oh, I'm so, like, too bad you couldn't have an orgasm. And it wasn't that I couldn't have one. I lived in a world that I didn't feel safe in my body. Once I figured that out, it was no problem. One woman wrote to me saying, well, I'm glad for you that you healed, but why did you start having to have so much sex and spend so much time in this pleasure mode, enjoying your body? And I said, because I was balancing out 40 years of not feeling good in your body. So the healing, the medicine has to match or go beyond the trauma, what had happened. So this was all my, post-traumatic growth. So if I just spend the rest of my life feeling good in my body, every day doing what feels good, that's enough. But we're so used to women being the martyrs, hanging on to, what's happened to us. It's not sexy. And we also, once you get on the other side of it, and it doesn't necessarily have to take years of therapy and working with experts. And this is why I actually, after all this, studied to become a sexological body worker, but I declined to do it because what I found is we're all looking for somebody to take us to where we need to take ourselves. There are great therapists in the world like you. There are great sensuality coaches in the world like me that can listen and offer directions to go in and make you feel witnessed and seen. But you're the expert on your body.
Yes.
You're the expert on your life.
Yes. I wanted to, of course, everybody listening, no, you couldn't see, but the entire time she was saying this last like 30 seconds, my whole body was like nodding. Yes, 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 yes. My ego was in the way in the beginning. It was in the way. It was limiting my healing. And I think it was limiting how I was showing up in the therapy space. Not that I wasn't serving to the best of my ability, but what it took me going to therapy to realize was that I am not actually, yes, I have training. Yes, I understand certain treatment modalities like cognitive behavioral therapy, narrative therapy. I mean, there are skills that I have, but what I really have understood therapy to be in terms of how I want to show up in it, it may not be this way for everyone, and I'm sure it's not this way for everyone, is that what I create is a space where people can hear, specifically women can hear themselves free of judgment, hear themselves speak. It occurred to me that when somebody speaks the truth enough, I can tell when somebody knows the answer to their question by the way they ask it. I'm just not really satisfied in the relationship, but I just don't know if I should say. Or I know that he's in a lot of pain when he yells at me, but it's like you can hear. And that is by no means, those examples that by no means were meant to be a judgment. They were just meant to be small examples of women know. And we just need space in our lives and the worlds that we create to hear ourselves. And journaling has been an incredible tool. Writing has been an incredible tool for that. And that's why I advocate journaling so much, because it's deepening the relationship between you and you. And as you were talking about the people who leave negative comments or comments on your body or comments on your work, especially, I don't know if you would consider this trolling, because I'm sure this woman had good intention. I don't know. I hope she had good intentions by asking you, well, why did you spend so much time with pleasure afterwards? Like, it's great that you found your orgasm, but why? I would be like, why not? Why not? Would you tell your child on Christmas morning, I know you found this toy and I love playing with it. I know it brings you a lot of happiness, but why are you playing with it so much? Because it feels fucking great. Like, why not? I recently, just 2 weeks ago, actually, had my first brush with, well, not my first, but I say one of my early brushes with someone having a very strong reaction to something that I said on social media, and wrote in all caps, wrote pretty aggressively. And it was a woman. It wasn't a man. And my body felt the jolt of these words. I didn't know if I just wanted to immediately delete it and block it. I didn't know how I wanted to respond. The thing that I came back to that helped me ultimately respond, which I did, which was, and I know that this is probably an expression that many of us have heard before, but what she thinks of me is none of my business. How I choose to interpret this or wear this or adopt this as a statement of my character is up to me. So I actually replied to her in if I would consider to be a pretty loving way. And then she actually removed the comment herself. But it is, I think, challenging when we desire to be seen and when we feel misinterpreted or misunderstood. That's hard to reconcile. And it sounds like you deal with that more than I realized.
Well, yeah. I mean, especially from my first film that came out, 20 years ago to every book, these are highly personal things. And I did not think for a moment of, they're going to be reviewed. And I assume people would go, well, wow, she's had maybe a difficult path and she made it through and there's some good things. But when somebody will say something very negative about your work and life, and it just is the way it is. Somebody had said to me once, 10% of the people will love you, a 10% will never like you, and it's that 80% in between. So, but it's still, we're human. It does hurt, but that's up to me to make the choice of what am I going to do in that moment. And like I said, my medicine for not feeling good in my body was to balance it out with what can I possibly do right now to feel good in my body for the rest of my life, and what choice I make today. And I witness this all the time with my grandchildren. And I know you have a young daughter.
Yes.
Yeah. And you'll start seeing this as she gets to be a toddler. They are constantly doing things that feel good in their body. They won't do something, over and over again that doesn't feel good. So they learn through play. I love observing them because it makes me remember, like, what are things that I, are going to make me feel good today. When women come to me, wanting to advice on feeling better in their body, one of the first things I tell them to do is a self massage for 3 to 5 minutes at the beginning of the day and the end of the day, and not just going through the motions, but actually tracing circles across your forearm and every part of your body, and going to those places that maybe you haven't touched, in a long time. The curve of your hips, just enjoying your body, because if you don't know how to enjoy your body, how is somebody else going to know? But it's flooding our body with feel-good chemicals, and it's the best pill you can take. It's just a simple, self-massage. And my body is very appreciative. What people, especially women, say, or the world talks about menopause so much for women when you get to a certain age, and you're just completely dismissed. And I'm like, no, I'm completely dismissing the way Western world handles menopause, because I don't see it in other places that I've traveled, where the women are respected as elders and they feel very good in their body and they're very confident. And that's the path I'm taking. And at this point in my life, it's the most sensual time in my life. And when I say sensual, it doesn't just refer to the number of orgasms I have. It's like, how can I bring that wellness and vitality into every day of my life?
You know what just occurred to me that I have not thought of, because my journey, which I've talked about on several podcasts before this one, but of actually deciding to get pregnant, trying to get pregnant, becoming pregnant, like that was not a straight and narrow path for me. And the planner in me didn't quite know what to do with that, didn't know how to reconcile feeling out of control of my body. And I remember Glennon Doyle saying something once that really stuck with me, that you don't control what you trust. Like there is no trust where you try to control. And an orgasm and sensuality, there is a letting go and an allowing that needs to take place in order for that to happen. And the other thing that just clicked for me as you were talking about menopause is that when a woman is no longer able to get pregnant, which my biological clock is very much in the forefront of my mind, it just, I was considered a geriatric pregnancy when I gave birth to my daughter, which was real sexy, especially in the most intimate, vulnerable time of my life. It's like, ooh, yes, not only are you the heaviest you've ever been, but you're old. When a woman's gone through menopause, sex is only for pleasure. Like it's fully claimed. It's sex for sex's sake. It is not for, and I know that there are plenty of people who choose not to have children, or it's not, I'm not saying that sex is always about reproduction, but I'm thinking more from a macro perspective and the roles and the expectations that women have versus what men have with sex and sexuality and sexual pleasure. It's like, there's no outcome other than pleasure. In a way, I wonder if menopause is when women can fully own their sex and fully own their sexual pleasure, because that's what's left.
Yeah. And we also live in the Western culture that dismisses women over a certain age of their bodies not being valuable or sexy. And what's interesting is once your body is stop focus on reproduction, whether you're choosing to have children or not, your body, while you're having your periods, is focused on reproduction. And and once that's over, it's the opposite. It's juicing up, all of your internal organs, and it's actually been the most sensual time of my life. So that was an unexpected pleasure.
I like that, juicing up your internal organs. That just felt so delicious. If we had conversations like this more about, ladies, when you stop having a period, your inner organs are going to feel so juicy. I would look forward to menopause. I've never heard it described like an experience to look forward to, but it's like, why resist it or deny it when it is inevitable? It's where we're all going, where some of us are going. I wanted to share, I hope it's all right that I'm reading a quote of yours back to you, but I wanted to read this aloud and then talk about this a little bit more. I decided to see if I could discover what it meant to be born into a body of a woman. I wanted to find out how to feel my orgasm and maybe how to feel my life, because at this point I wasn't feeling anything. So we've already touched on some of these themes, but there was something about the language of what it meant to be born into the body of a woman. Mm-hmm. There seemed to be like this sacred was the word that came to mind. Can you elaborate more on being born into the body of a woman? Can you just tell me more about that?
Well, it was something that as a child and young woman, and into my 30s and early 40s, I didn't see anything sacred about it. There was no value. And I'm not projecting that my parents raised me this way, but the world that I lived in, I was second class. I was going to get married, have the children, have a career, but it's not going to be as important as the husband's career. And I was not going to be an equal. And there was definitely nothing sacred about it. I did not grow up in that world, even with two sisters and my mother. When I had my period, I didn't tell anybody, pulled out the sheet from the package, trying to figure out how to work everything and where everything's located. When really the women were the creators. We're the most connected to, we call Mother Earth, because Mother Earth is a creator. And I'm glad with circles like Koya and many other communities now, the divine feminine is rising and women's voices are being heard. We see the signs that says the future is female. I don't think the future is female. The future is all of us together and all of us being witnessed and all of us being heard. I didn't accept myself as a fully alive woman until I healed that damage that started in my childhood of being disconnected, of not feeling safe in my body. And so how are you going to enjoy being a young girl or a young woman or a mother or a wife when you have secrets and shame. So I'm glad that there was no book I read, there was no class I took. It just finally got to, I was curious, and I also was at such a low point with sadness and loneliness. And finally, as I said, stopping blaming the world that I lived in and started looking, well, is there anything I can do to try to fix this? And I didn't want it to be a pill, which there's nothing wrong, especially with antidepressants or other medicine, but I had tried that and it didn't work. So I got curious, and when we can stop beating ourselves up and seeing the sacred in ourselves, even before we heal, even before we've forgiven someone, even before we've forgiven ourselves, if we can see the sacred just in being born here on this earth at this time, then if we're going to value our body, then when we see somebody, we're going to value them too. And right now we have such violence in the world because we're not connected to the sacredness of our own body. So we can't connect to the sacredness of every other human, not just the ones that look like you, not just the ones that make a certain amount of money, not just the ones that live in your neighborhood, every single human.
Well, this makes me think of when you there was an article you wrote about your experience, your journey to getting to Zimbabwe. And you talk about everywhere I travel, I look for the footprints of women and I follow them until I see a path more clearly for myself. At the very beginning, you talked about that zing, that feeling that kind of lit you up. And I shared a similar experience. I remember seeing a commencement address where Steven Spielberg talked about creativity came to him in whispers. It's interesting too that you talk about I was in such a low place that you were just looking for something. The experience that's coming up for me as I was listening to you, when I got pregnant the first time and miscarried just shy of 12 weeks, we've talked a lot about sort of the pain and then what can come after when there's healing, and that healing's been given space and time. And for me, the pain silenced the noise, the head chatter and the head trash and the internal critic. It was quiet in my mind for maybe the first time, and I don't even know how long. And I was able to hear the whispers, and I was able to get curious about, nothing is promised, no day is guaranteed, and nothing I could have done could have prevented this loss. So what will help me feel more alive? And that was the journey, or part of the journey, where I decided to start making more things, because the people pleaser in me also loved approval. I didn't just want people to be happy. I wanted everyone to like me and everything that I did. And so as a result, I didn't do a lot of things because I wasn't creating enough opportunity for people to judge me, which kept my little ego safe, but also I wasn't being fully seen. In that piece that you wrote about going to Zimbabwe, you talk about how you were going to adopt a daughter and that she wasn't alive when you got there. I read that and I shed a couple tears. It just, heart to heart, there was something so profound, not just in the loss, but in what her life connected you to, her footprints, what that introduced you to a country and a place that you've been to almost 30 times. And so I want to thank you, for me personally, for you sharing that story, because I never know when a new layer of healing is going to happen. And that definitely was in reading that for me. But I would just love to hear you talk a little bit more about those footprints, following the footprints of women, that curiosity for you.
Well, I will say with Zimbabwe, and this was 2008, so I've been divorced 10 years and I always wanted more children. So out of the blue, got a call. It seemed like a miracle. Got on a plane 3 weeks later with 300 pounds of supplies. Never, been to Zim, never been to the continent of Africa, and didn't know anybody there but the person that was going to pick me up at the airport. And I talk about this in that show that you saw, Chasing Temples. But it was this moment of, back in the US, I was still living with unexpressed pain from years of not feeling safe in my body. I had a failed marriage, but a good post-divorce. But I just, like so many of us, just dismissed things that had happened as move on for that. So at the time, the footprints, it wasn't so much following of footprints, it was running away from mine. Like the footprints were running away from all these things. So here, and in the show and book, I talk about this, so here I end up in this country the day I arrive at the airport. And it's weird. I looked at the woman that was picking me up, knowing 1 minute before I was going to see her and I was excited, get to see the baby. And I looked at her and I just said, she died. Oh. And she said, yes, she died. I mean, it's like, I don't even know where that came from. So on my way there, she had died. The baby had died. So I'm in this country that is in the middle of chaos. They had a cholera outbreak, the hyperinflation, government corrupt. There's no water or electricity. I'm running from the footprints of my chaos back in the US into this country that matched my chaos in a different way. But it was during that trip that I just had to let go. When you talk about the pain silencing the noise, there at the time, the electricity was cut off. I couldn't, for 2 days, I didn't even call my family, couldn't get a clear line through. They're expecting me to fly back with a baby. But also during those 2 days, I was able to keep like that dream alive and somehow. I always hate when things aren't going well and people say, say what you're grateful for. Those nights in Zimbabwe, I did gratitudes all night long because that was what was like keeping me alive, because it was such a painful moment. And I had lost during my last pregnancy in my marriage. But this was a whole different thing. I'm literally in a place I don't know, same with people I don't know. And their attitude was, oh, there are plenty of abandoned babies here. Just choose another one. But that's because they live with this trauma and devastation every day. But it was those, as you said, nothing is promised. Nothing is promised. And what came out of that moment, that baby's footprints, was these 27 trips, very intense healing experience there with a shaman named Gogo. I've taken over 50 people on retreats there. I'm going again next year in 2022. I'm very connected to the land, the animals. For me, the elephants there at the place we stay, they recognize you every time you go. So when we talk about our dreams for ourselves and our life, I mean, all of our life is filled with pain. Instead of not expressing it and then lashing out of somebody else, maybe even on social networking, because we can't say our own truth, so you lash out at Danielle for what she's saying. Can we feel our pain? We don't grow up with expressing our pain, feeling safe expressing our pain, feeling it, and then moving beyond it, being curious what's beyond it, because most people don't get beyond their pain.
Something that just clicked for me as I was listening to you, there's such a difference between accessing gratitude in a real way as opposed to the attitude of gratitude versus the practice of gratitude. It's helpful when it's helpful, and when it's not, just don't. It's so hard to conceptualize, probably because it doesn't make sense. It doesn't follow a concept or a construct of grief that makes sense to me logically, but it made sense. It felt right in the moment. Once I allowed myself to drop into the grief, and I don't mean drop below it and numb or run from it and get very busy and active, but actually drop into it and feel it, I was so grateful for the silence. Again, I wasn't grateful for the loss. I wasn't trying to paint a rosy picture on that pain. And also, because it's definitely an and, not a but, and feeling it cracked something open in me that can't be closed. And for that, I am very grateful. I want to shift gears just a little bit. And I have 2 final questions for you before we wrap up this interview. And it was so great. There's so many other things. We could spend an entire episode just on Africa. I want to hear more about Africa. I mean, there's just so many other things we could explore, but I want to be mindful of your time and also our listeners' time. What is the best advice you've ever been given?
Best advice I've ever been given. Well, this sounds so simple. It was my godmother, who I was named after. My given name is Betty Jane, after my godmother. When I was going through the loss of that 5th baby that I delivered at the end of my marriage, and having 4 happy kids, you're expecting another one, and all of a sudden you lose everything. My children lost their mom. I just checked out. I didn't know how to grieve. I didn't know how to be sad. I was told just to take Prozac and get over it. My godmother came to me in a dream, and she was sitting next to me on the edge of my bed. I literally woke up and I could see the imprint. She was a tiny woman. And she just said, it's going to be okay. Everything is going to be okay. And it sounds so simple, but I've had other people that have had experiences of loved ones coming to them from beyond. and saying a similar thing. And I'm like, here you have this big moment of like saying something profound, but it's actually true. Even in the most challenging moments, it's going to be okay. It really is going to be okay. And the advice I give to others is to be the authority on your body. Listen to yourself. For your best writing coach is going to be yourself. Go in circles, work with people that inspire you, and then listen. We don't need another Glennon. We don't need another Brene Brown. We need whatever you're offering. So listen to that voice that's coming through. Stop searching for it in someone else. Listen to that voice that you have.
I'm letting myself take that in. I needed that last one. Stop searching for it in someone else. That's good. Well, Betsy, I have one final question for you. And I love ending conversations this way because I just find that it's those little moments in life that go unexpectedly that usually bear great fruit, whether it's humor and finding a way to kind of laugh at the silliness of things or a great lesson. But I would love to hear your don't cut your own bang moment.
Well, when Autobiography of an Orgasm came out, I didn't have expectations, but I thought people would be at least kind. And that didn't happen. Some of the people closest to me really rejected me, didn't support me. And now it is 7 years later, and those relationships have all come back around. It took a while, but the ones that rejected me at first have come back and been the most supportive and appreciative now. So I think when we do something bold and brave and publish our first book or do our first podcast and those closest to us may not be cheering us on, give yourself some time because you might inspire them. You might open up something. Their initial rejection of you may be that for the first time that they're seeing their unexpressed, the areas of their lives that have been unexpressed. And so that has been sweet to have people come back around. But in the end, it was, I didn't need anybody else's validation. It was a moment for the first time in my life to validate my voice and my worth, no matter what happened with the book, because this was my lived experience. And I was giving myself permission to tell it.
I hope you enjoyed listening and learning and laughing alongside Betsy Murphy and myself. It was an absolute delight to share that space with her. She was so generous with her time. If you want to connect with Betsy, if you want to connect with her work, her resources, and just learn more about her, all of the links will be there for you in the show notes. You can hop on over there. You can take her workshops. You can go to Zimbabwe with her. You can learn to publish a book with her, or you can go watch one of her shows. I saw her perform live in a one-woman play, and it was phenomenal. As always, your time, your care, your attention, they mean more to me than you know. I'm so, so glad that you were here listening. And I look forward to connecting with you again in the next episode.